In early July of 1963, I was 9 years old then, about to turn 10. We were moving from Newark, Delaware to Ann Arbor, Michigan. My father was going from being the only anthropologist in the entire state of Delaware to being one of 40 anthropologists in just one department of one of the country's finest universities. It was a huge opportunity for him, but more important to our besieged family of four, it would permit my desperately ill mother better medical care. The University of Michigan, you see, also had a great hospital. My mother would be saved, we hoped. On the day in question, the moving van had just taken away just about everything we owned, and my father, who had gone out ahead and left our puny French compact car in Ann Arbor, had come back with a gigantic American station wagon, a rental we could ill afford that would take us to a new life in Michigan. Meanwhile, for many years, Mrs. Jennings, I never heard her first name spoken, it was always Mrs. Jennings, an African-American woman, had been our cleaning lady. As my mother's illness progressed, as she had longer and longer stays in hospitals in Wilmington, Delaware, and New York City, Mrs. Jennings became more and more of a substitute mother, greeting us as we got back from school, cooking our meals, drying my tears and tenderly holding me after my favorite cat died as I bravely chiseled out its name on a brick. I loved Mrs. Jennings. As we left our house that day, the station wagon groaned under the weight of our remaining possessions. My parents up front, my brother and me in the back. But we had one last stop to make, my parents said, to say one last farewell. It was to Mrs. Jennings' house. She literally lived across the tracks on Cleveland Avenue in the black section of town. She greeted us warmly as she always did, but she was also clearly quite upset and worried to see us go, concerned about our family's obviously dire predicament. Just as we were about to head off for the more than 12-hour drive to our new home, Mrs. Jennings leaned into the back of the car to give me a hug and a kiss goodbye. Something came over me. I suddenly recoiled, pressed myself into the farthest corner of the back seat, and wouldn't let her. Now, this was the early 60s. I had heard the N-word used frequently in my neighborhood growing up, but had known in my bones and from my parents' stern lectures that it was wrong. Yet I had also somehow allowed myself to be infected with the prejudice that had metastasized throughout my country. Mrs. Jennings understood completely and made no fuss about it. She knew. My father, on the other hand, waited only a few seconds after we had pulled away before he stopped the car and turned around and said to me, "Young man, I am so disappointed in you." I was disappointed in myself, and I have felt the sharp sting of disappointment now for 53 years and carried the guilt of that inexcusable snub. Later, I convinced myself that my lifelong interest in the subject of race in America was born in the anguished transference that took place there at Mrs. Jennings' curb on Cleveland Avenue in Newark, Delaware in 1963. And in the coming years, as death grew closer to our door, when I would lie awake at night replaying that horrible moment, paralyzed too by irrational fears of fire hoses and dogs in Selma, confusing and conflating the cancer that was killing my country with a cancer that was killing and would kill my family. From Thomas Jefferson to Lewis and Clark, from the West, the Statue of Liberty and the national parks. Yes, the national parks. Their first protectors were the African-American Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry. To the heavyweight champion Jack Johnson in a film called Unforgivable Blackness. From Prohibition, the Roosevelts, and the war about World War II, to the Shakers and Mark Twain, race percolates close to the surface in nearly every project I've worked on. Our world is chaotic. We know deep down that we are mortal, that none of us get out of this alive. So to keep that wolf from our cabin door, we human beings seek always to find some frame to understand things, to overlay some order on that randomness of events, to find some meaning in it all precisely because of our inevitable mortality. But Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun, may be all that we need to understand to help us tell and organize our stories. That truth might appear fatalistic or pessimistic, even discouraging, that we've made no progress. but it also means that we can often divine in history, and I believe particularly in biography, the way human beings are. Sometimes that human nature is reassuring and inspirational. Sometimes it is unsettling, but it is always useful, and it echoes in our daily life today. Ghosts, haunting ghosts, who may turn out in the end to be our greatest teachers.